Hello, and welcome to episode 69 of the Sci-Fi Podcast. From Atlanta, Georgia, I'm Nick Zoutra. First, I wanted to give a warm welcome back to our listeners. It's been nearly a year since our last podcast episode. For those of us who are just joining, this is Sci-Fi, a podcast featuring philosophers of science who engage with scientists in interesting ways. New episodes will be available bi-weekly on Spotify, and be sure to follow us on Twitter at Sci-Fi Pod. On this podcast, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Maya Goldenberg, Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Guelph. Maya's research addresses the fundamental epistemic question, how do we know what to believe? Or more specifically, when are knowledge claims justified in healthcare? Maya's past scholarship has addressed this question in the pressing context of evidence-based medicine, the decision-making framework that relies on clinical trial evidence, especially randomized controlled trials, to inform individual patient care. More recently, Maya has broadened her research into the science values complex to investigate vaccine hesitancy. Her new book, Vaccine Hesitancy, Public Trust, Expertise, and the War on Science, explores vaccine hesitancy and refusal among parents in the industrialized North. Although biomedical, public health, and popular science literature has focused on a scientifically ignorant public, the real problem, Maya argues, lies not in our misunderstanding, but in mistrust. Public confidence in scientific institutions and government bodies has been shaken by fraud, research scandals, and misconduct. Maya's book reveals how vaccine studies sponsored by the pharmaceutical industry, compelling rhetorics from the anti-vaccine movement, and the spread of populist knowledge on social media have all contributed to a public mistrust of the scientific consensus. Importantly, it also emphasizes how historical and current discrimination in healthcare against marginalized communities continues to shape public perception of institutional trustworthiness. Maya ultimately reframes vaccine hesitancy as a crisis of public trust rather than a war on science, arguing that having good scientific support of vaccine efficacy and safety is not enough. In a fraught communications landscape, her new book, Vaccine Hesitancy, advocates for trust-building measures that focus on relationships, transparency, and justice. And thus, without further ado, let's bring in Maya. Dr. Maya Goldenberg, welcome to the Sci-Fi Podcast. How are you this Thursday morning?
Well, I'm as good as I can be during a pandemic, but it is nice to be here. I'm a fan of your show.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we just had a brief little, a pre-show chat, and it was good to hear that you've gotten to listen to some episodes. I know it's been a little while, but it's wonderful to come back, and it's wonderful to have you yourself as essentially the first guest back after this long break. So yeah, very
thank you.
Very excited. I've been missing this. Having some good chats on during the mornings with philosophers of science who might be in tangentially related interests of my own, and love learning a little bit more. How's the I would say, I guess, spring semester going for you so far?
The spring semester, I'm technically on sabbatical for this one semester, so
nice.
I'm not teaching. I did have the full experience of teaching online in the fall semester. I found it challenging, but the students showed resilience. They want to advance their degrees. They want to make this work, so they did it. This semester, though, as I mentioned, I'm on sabbatical. I thought I'd be traveling the world, promoting my book, doing launches and tours and that kind of thing. My book just came out just at the beginning of March 2021. But instead, I'm still doing a tour, but it's a virtual book tour. I have not left my office to do it.
Wow! So tell me a little. Yeah, that's interesting. How do you do a virtual book tour?
It just means that I give a lot of talks. I let myself be available for media and talks all through these kinds of online platforms.
Yeah.
The benefit of that is I've traveled the world, and I've gotten to places that I wouldn't otherwise be able to go just because of distance and time and things like that. I think my tour has been a lot more international than it would have been if I was actually flying from place to place.
That's fascinating. What's one of maybe the farthest places, or perhaps the most unusual of places that you wouldn't have expected to pitch your book?
Well, I was in very short order. I presented my work in Australia,
nice.
And then in Brazil, and I've been even to Australia a second time. So that's pretty far for a Canadian like me.
Understandable. Yeah. Well, that's great to hear. Hope you're enjoying the sabbatical and getting getting the exposure on the book, which we will definitely talk about later on in this interview. The book Vaccine, Hesitancy, Public Trust, Expertise, and the War on Science. No, that's great. So I guess, I'm very interested in getting to discuss this particular work and your current projects. But before we jump into those things, why don't we take a little step back to get to know you yourself as a person, as a researcher, how you came to be interested in these questions and studying such things. So, Maya, tell us a little bit about where you grew up.
Well, I'm originally from Toronto, and I did my first degree at the University of Toronto, and then a master's at McGill and a PhD at Michigan State University. And I got lucky that I got a job near to home. I'm at the University of Guelph,
That's
which
right, yes.
is about an hour's drive from Toronto, which is where my family and extended family are situated.
Well, very nice. So, growing up, what kind of interests did you have? What were you? Was it always sort of an academic path? What did mom and dad do growing up? What was going on?
Oh, I had the sort of funny thing where I grew up with an academic father, and my mother was a community college teacher. Mm-hmm. One was an engineer, another was an architect, and they both had the very strong view that liberal arts degrees were not worth the paper they were printed on.
Oh,
so I did grow up with the expectation that I would do university and probably postgraduate training, but certainly not in the humanities. So I think I see now that it was in large part an act of rebellion to study philosophy and to prove them wrong and to let them see the value of humanities research.
Right. Oh, fantastic. Okay, so I imagine, did this involve doing some? I mean, was this like an early math and science study? And I guess maybe tell us a little bit about what brought into what brought you to the transition to, I guess, get into the humanities for yourself?
Good question. For me, it was in my first year of university. I entered the University of Toronto as a Bachelor of Science major. I didn't really know where I was going, but I was following the science path that my parents thought was the advisable way. And it really didn't take very long into that first semester. I guess because the level of work was so intense that I finally did that think about where am I actually going with this and what do I actually want to spend all this time doing. So in my first semester, I dropped first year chemistry and was able to pick up a philosophy of science course and never looked back. I just loved it.
Was there a professor or two at the time there in Toronto that you particularly liked, or was it or ideas, for example, that kind of brought you into it?
I was really moved by the great bioethics courses I was able to take at the University of Toronto. So this was still not as established as it is today, but Toronto had some great people. I see now that it wasn't as well established as it felt because they were all short-term people and graduate students teaching the courses, which is apparently a sign that it doesn't have institutional support. But I wasn't aware of that because these graduate students, they were PhD candidates and short-term staff were excellent. And they really allowed me to nurture this idea that that I still hold today, that philosophy is and can be a very powerful tool for thinking through complex social problems. And I still do that today. I fell into this sort of public philosophy because I think philosophy has something to offer. And I saw that first in these undergraduate courses where we were dealing with pressing issues that were right in front of us. I liked the metaphysics too, but this was my passion.
Absolutely. And so what was it, what do you think it is about, for example, I guess the tools in terms of using philosophy in this sort of a way to explore such ideas, and in such a way in publicly that perhaps other modes of doing, let's say, I would say, I don't know, basically coming at it from a training in philosophy and bioethics, as opposed to coming from his training as a physician or as a scientist. Is there something particularly unique that this humanities training can bring or potentially add?
Well, the humanities training gives us strength in critical thinking, and I don't think anyone would disagree with that. And we have all kinds of empirical evidence of, let's say, philosophy majors doing well on the LSAT and the analytics section of the GRE. So we know that to be the case. But we also acquire these skills to investigate arguments. So when we read the newspaper or think about how ideas and problems are typically framed, it's the philosophers have a good skill to really unpack that. And we'll talk about my book soon, but I feel like that's exactly what I did in my work on vaccine hesitancy, was that I looked at a dominant narrative that had been put together largely by scientists, clinical and social scientists, and said, there's problems with this argument, and it's leading us in directions that don't quite fit the situation that we're in.
Excellent. Yeah, no, I can certainly relate with a lot of those ideas, and especially just spending time with different groups. The different trainings lead you to different thinking, and certainly there's critical thinking training in science, absolutely, but there's just different focus. There's a different division of labor sometimes, and so having that ability in such a class, I'm thrilled to hear that graduate students did well teaching bioethics classes. That's something personally have experienced and that's seen before. And right, as an undergrad, you don't really know the politics of the institution and exactly kind of at what state exactly it's in. But glad to hear that there were some good folks there. So I suppose then in studying in Toronto, then I see here went in to study at a little bit explore at McGill, and then went on, I suppose, to Michigan State to do your PhD. And so right. Michigan State is known for their philosophy of science programs and some history and philosophy of science, as well as bioethics. There's a number of folks we've had on the show actually there who are teaching now. I believe Sean Baez, Robin Bloom. Tell us briefly a little bit about your experience there, and a little bit about what you studied and how you came to, I guess a little bit about your intellectual development there.
Sure. I went there to study bioethics. That's what I thought my PhD topic would be, and it was only when I got to the devising of the project that I shifted more towards philosophy of science. And I had to do some catch up. I actually hadn't done philosophy of science, not even as an undergraduate. So I wanted to do bioethics. At the time, it still is very well known for bioethics, but at the time it was a very good choice for anyone doing bioethics. Jamie Nelson was my supervisor, and I got to work with Hilda Lindemann and Lisa Schwartzman in social and political philosophy. There were so many good people that I really valued my time there. When I got to the pick your topic stage of PhD, I thought I would pick up something in bioethics, and I found myself kind of looking through anthologies and thinking about what I wanted to add to, and I just couldn't find that thing that I really wanted to really sink into. And at the time, it was a coincidence. I was back in Toronto that summer, and I got a research assistantship at Sick Kids Hospital. So that's our renowned children's hospital in Toronto. And they have a bioethicist there. She's passed, but her name was Christine Harrison. And through my contacts at University of Toronto that I'd still sustained since undergraduate, they have a joint center for bioethics there that I still have friends and colleagues there. I was able to get a research assistantship, and she Dr. Harrison put me on the job of working out a policy for complementary and alternative medicine for use in the hospital, because they were trying to deal with some issues. Their parents coming in, making requests, and wanting to do alternative treatment. So they were working on policy. So I was doing the research end of that, and the philosophical questions about how we think about alternative medicine as a category jumped out to me as something really interesting, and I'll say quickly about that everything that is complementary and alternative medicine is this weird category of all things that are not considered biomedical. It's a shifting category, and it's so broad that it's hard to actually point to the thing that makes it distinct, other than to say it's not biomedicine. So it's a not category. And it was always being positioned against evidence-based medicine. And at the time, I must confess, I'd never heard the term evidence-based medicine before. And when I looked into it, I realized, wow, this was already almost 10 years in development. It's actually started in Canada, so it's got strong Canadian roots in the medical community. Yes, and not just that, but all the bioethics that I've been doing since my undergraduate still use this term biomedicine or the biomedical system. And it was using it in this phrasing that really hadn't changed since, let's say, the 1970s, when medical humanities started becoming critical of the sort of technocratic regime of biomedicine. And I was like, why isn't there philosophy on this term, evidence-based medicine? And I had this suspicion that perhaps there'd been too much siloism within bioethics, that they were reading each other and not keeping up with what was going on in the medical world, because that term biomedicine was obsolete. So I started researching that, and this was a new topic. I actually met two grad students doing similar topics, and the three of us became friends. You mentioned Robin Bloom. She was one of them. Kirsten Borgerson and Dalhousie was another. And it was an exciting time, because we're kind of working in this area of philosophy that some of the critical content was already there within the minority of critics in biomedicine, but it hadn't really made it into philosophy and bioethics. So it turned into more of a science, a philosophy of science project. It was really on the nature of evidence and what do we mean when we say something is evidence-based, and it's got a lot of political context to shape the power of evidence-based medicine, why it's considered the standard, the best standard, or gold standard for medical practice, and why things like complementary and alternative medicine can be maligned because it doesn't meet those standards. So this was actually a philosophy of science project, and it was a project that I was really able to get into because it was exciting, it was new, and it was interesting.
Thank you for sharing that. No, that's fascinating, and I mean, I've heard certainly and discussed quite a bit about evidence-based medicine. Perhaps you could say a little bit more. So what would you say is to be, since biomedicine essentially has become obsolete, what are some of the hallmark features that would demarcate evidence-based medicine from folks who would just describe biomedicine? And I imagine there are times when folks just, they still use the term biomedicine just, without really thinking about it. But now that we're really getting toward evidence-based, was there some, I guess I'm a little bit interested in the history of the term, and then perhaps the political sort of motivations for the term, as well as, then the philosophical, sort of the content of the concept is, and how that is, I suppose, shaping the medical and biomedical landscapes.
So the major moves that evidence-based medicine brought to, let's say, biomedicine, or call it allopathic medicine, call it what you want, is an emphasis on using epidemiological methods in the clinical setting. So before it was called evidence-based medicine, it was called clinical epidemiology. That was an area of study at McMaster University in Ontario. I mentioned this as the Canadian origins of evidence-based medicine. And among the techniques and methods that includes was an emphasis on randomized controlled trials as the hallmark of good evidence. So that is what prompted philosophical criticism, first by some physicians with some sense of the sort of philosophical implications, but then further developed by philosophers like myself, this idea that you can create a hierarchy of evidence and that it is somehow going to be applicable to all or most things. Most sort of careful methodologists would say you pick the method that suits the question, while evidence-based medicine turned it around and said, this is the right method, and they actually reconfigured how many clinical questions are asked in order to make best use of those trials. And in some places that works. Drug trials, as pharmaceutical trials, are in most cases best suited for randomized controlled trials, but there are other areas of health research that are not. Places where randomized controlled trials sometimes are unethical, but even putting that aside, there are places where you need the qualitative measures and you need a more pragmatic account of the evidence we see before us. So randomized controlled trials are very good for excising all kinds of biases. Not all biases, but many can be taken out. But the difficulty is that with this kind of clean data that it can provide, we sometimes lose important nuance. And that's why we sometimes get a big disconnect between what we find in the trial and what happens in the real world, where people don't fit the patient profile and don't have the access to the same resources that an academic health center does.
So this is getting into. Was there like I'm trying to think of like a case example of something like this would happen if, I don't know, I guess a unique. I don't know. Was there an example that you maybe had in mind, or if there's something that you've explored in maybe one of your cases that you could share? I'm trying to get a sense of how that would look like.
Oh, gosh, it's been a while since I've looked at this.
I'm sorry to.
Yeah, I feel like I should have it.
Oh no, I mean.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't.
That's
have
okay.
One hand.
No,
I'll think of one tomorrow. And
of course.
Yeah.
No, but thank you for going over. I'm very. It's fascinating to hear about the history of evidence-based medicine and its origins. And I imagine this work in discussing the nature of evidence, has led obviously to a number of other contemporary works of yours. So once you worked on these projects at Michigan State, and then went on to what was a little bit about your career trajectory after that?
I had a very brief postdoc at the University of Toronto, an interdisciplinary postdoc, which was interesting. I had a psychologist as my advisor, Dr. Gillian Einstein, and we worked on feminist embodiment theory. So you have to. So this postdoc it's no longer available, unfortunately, but it tried to pair people up with some kind of director who was not in your area of study, so that you could learn from each other. So it was an interesting time. So as I mentioned, we worked on feminist embodiment theories, and I was hired at the University of Guelph before I finished that postdoc. So I abandoned it because I was eager to make a full salary for the obvious practical reasons. And then I went to the University of Guelph, and I've been there ever since.
Wow. So so how have you liked? Is there anything defining features about University of Guelph you can share? I suppose also interested enough, how perhaps research university, from let's say a Big Ten school in Michigan State, which is located, for those internationally, in the Midwestern portion of the United States, to an hour away from Toronto. So, and how has that been in terms of returning home, so to speak, and or returning to doing research in Canada?
It was nice. I was always hoping to stay in and around Toronto just because I had my roots there. So it was pretty thrilling to be able to do that. And I've enjoyed my time at the University of Guelph. It's a big campus, but not huge, and it has a broad research base. So I meet all kinds of interesting people doing a variety of things. In fact, my recent work on public trust and vaccine hesitancy has created all kinds of connections to people we have an agricultural college at the University of Guelph as well as a vet college, and I've made contacts with people in both of those colleges. Normally we don't have that much connection with each other because they are similarly dealing with public trust in science, on a variety of issues. So I'll give you an example. I was called into a nutrition group at the vet college who wanted to talk to me about raw food diets. So they're struggling with this phenomena of people who don't trust pet food and don't think it's as optimally suited for their dogs, and they feed them raw meat instead, and that creates all kinds of concerns about transmission of bacteria from dog to dog, from dog to human as well. And they were wondering what kind of communications should vets be doing towards the public, because at least this communications researcher said to me the tendency of veterinarians is to say, "Oh, these people, let me just give them the facts," they'd sort of heard about my work and they said, "We suspect you're going to tell us that isn't the way to convince people." And yes, indeed. And we, unfortunately, it got shut down right as our university campus closed, but we'd actually had some in-person meetings where I described what I see as characteristic vaccine hesitant parents. And I read them charitably, where I don't think they're stupid and I don't think they're selfish. I think they're struggling to make the best choices for their kids and they're worried. And they nodded, the people in the group nodded the whole way. They said, yeah, dog owners are like that too. So they could see the misgivings there. So one's worried about big pharma. These are the parents. The other one's worried about big pet food.
Big puppy chow or something.
Yeah, big puppy. That's the one. And and they similarly were trying to do what is best for the animals or children in their care. And we're struggling with information and misinformation and fear, and they were the parallels were there.
Thank you. No, thank you for sharing that and that anecdote about the veterinarian. As a dog owner, as a corgi owner myself, I've not heard about this raw pet food movement, but I've heard about these kinds of just mistrusts in particular ways of doing and being based. And I'm interested to hear kind of exactly, like, I'm sure you've can describe a little bit perhaps about the logic or like maybe the typical trajectories of how these mistrusts kind of develop. But yeah, so let's jump right in, I suppose, because I know you've been very busy. I can see lots of publications, lots of interviews over the recently in terms of engaging with your work. And so, tell us a little bit about, obviously it sounds like these interests have led up to working on vaccine hesitancy, but perhaps, a little bit of origin of how you came to begin working on the book, how the book developed. Again, the title of the book, Vaccine Hesitancy, Public Trust, Expertise, and the War on Science, published literally, University of Pittsburgh in March of this year. So, tell us a little bit about the origins and how what the book's about.
So I'll begin because we talked a little bit about my history working on evidence-based medicine. So that this was my area, as a philosopher of medicine, a philosopher of science, working on how evidence and arguments are operationalized in order to justify knowledge about health and healthcare. So that used to the debate about evidence-based medicine is how we get from the hierarchy of evidence and the methods to justify, let's say, clinical practice guidelines. So that's sort of internal to it. This project expanded my work on how scientific evidence informs action and thinking and policy to science and the public. So now it was more public facing. So it was sort of widening that lens. I didn't set out exactly to do this. I'll tell you, my interest in vaccine hesitancy started just because, and this is around pediatric vaccine hesitancy. When I started this work, I really got into it seriously around 2015, but it had sort of been on my mind prior to that, as many of us that are interested in science and medicine were watching this phenomena of vaccine hesitancy among parents in industrialized nations. And the interest has always been because it seems odd. I mean, the science consensus is so strong in countries with stable health systems. We've made vaccines highly accessible. Many countries, you get them for free, even, or part of your taxes, of course. So and also communications have been very strong around the safety and necessity and efficacy of vaccines ever since that kind of Andrew Wakefield incident of the late 1990s, when that notorious study was published in The Lancet that linked autism and MMR. It was. Yeah. Do you remember that?
Okay, of course. I didn't. Wakefield didn't immediately resonate, but of course,
right. He was the primary investigator of that study, and he really did the media around it. So eventually, all but one of his co-authors retracted on this study because they'd really done some overextension in their discussion and conclusions. They really it probably shouldn't have been published for that reason alone. What they said and what they showed and what they concluded did not match. So he was the one kind of taking this forward. So he was already a public figure in this whole vaccine narrative. But my interest really started around, it was after I'd read this expose in the British Medical Journal. It was done by an investigative reporter named Brian Deere, and he published this 3-part article in the BMJ in early 2011. And he exposed that Wakefield had fabricated his data for this notorious study. So the study had already been retracted, first for ethics violations. Wakefield had lost his license. There'd been many, many hits against this notorious study. But this was the newest finding, was that he'd actually fabricated the data, and his co-authors at least claimed they weren't aware of it. So I read this. It was pretty damning. And I expected, reading this, I thought, well, so much for vaccine hesitancy. I thought the autism MMR thesis would die right there. And I think a lot of people who read that article expected that to happen. But as we watched in the years that followed, that was clearly not the case. The theory was still alive and well, that autism is caused by vaccines. And there were, continuous preventable disease outbreaks in the United States and elsewhere. And by some measures, vaccine hesitancy was even rising. So I kind of thought, what's up here? This is where I got interested. I said, what's going on here? What's with these people? What evidence is going to convince them that vaccines are safe and necessary? And I thought this would be a short project. I thought, as a philosopher of science, especially a medical epistemologist, I thought I could figure out what is that missing piece of information, and this might be a short project. So as I started getting into it, I quickly realized I was asking the wrong question. Most people come at this thinking there's some missing piece of information. If I just provide it, and then everyone will see and they'll follow. That was the wrong framing of the question. There's a lot of assumptions packed into that question that I'd unwittingly accepted. And it just wasn't the case. It is not scientific misinformation or misunderstanding that's driving vaccine hesitancy. And that's when the project got really interesting.
Yeah, great. And so the general argument is describing that what I see here is it's not necessarily a public misunderstanding because, again, you release these reports, you would see like a headline, fabrication of data. Guess what? The 1 out of a million studies that have been done doesn't show anything. We can put that to bed. Yet persistence, mistrust of science. And I should say, in terms of public, you say something like public mistrust of science. What do you mean by that? So not necessarily, I mean, is it a mistrust of particular data sets? Is it mistrust of the general, the practice in itself? What do you believe to be, I guess I'm curious of what exactly you mean by that.
I specifically mean public mistrust of the scientific institutional framework, or what we sometimes call the system in scare quotes. And there's a lot of reason to think that there is wavering trust, and that is largely shaped by the social identities and communities people live in. But there is less than optimal trust between the public and the scientific institutions. That has played out very explicitly during COVID, but it was the case before that too. So when I started getting into the research and trying to look a little more critically at the empirical research available on vaccine hesitancy, it became very apparent to me that people trust vaccines to the extent that they trust the system that develops and regulates and legislates vaccines. And that point really does bear out in the survey research on vaccine hesitancy. So, for example, there was last year there was a global survey of COVID vaccine acceptance. It came out in the summer, and people were polled, tens of thousands of people in about 100 countries, and were asked, how likely are you to get a COVID vaccine? This was before there was an actual COVID vaccine, but they were already trying to track these measures. And it was very noticeable that the people that were more likely to get the vaccines, or at least said they would likely or for sure get the vaccines, were also the people that polled higher on trusting the government to manage the pandemic. And this has been seen before during pandemics and other health crises, is people will take the vaccine to the extent that they trust the government that brings them the vaccine. So during H1N1, there was research of this sort, and there was I've seen data from the U.S. and from France, and quite similarly, if you trusted the government to adequately manage the pandemic, you're more likely to trust the vaccine as being safe and the right healthcare decision for you.
Fascinating. Okay, and so I know I mentioned it in the book, and I must admit I haven't read it yet, but I'm very excited to read it. There's a couple, there's some culprits that you would imagine have been responsible for this in terms of it. Who are the major ones?
I whittle it down to two major drivers of vaccine hesitancy. One is financial conflicts of interest in medical research and healthcare practice. So the worry that the pharmaceutical industry has too much sway over health research and health practice, that is a major driver. It at times gets dismissed as conspiratorial thinking, and that is the wrong way to think about it. And the other one is the experiences of healthcare injustices, including medical racism, is a major driver of vaccine hesitancy. And that's become kind of publicly known around the COVID vaccine only because there was survey research done, again, before there even was one, where they went into racialized communities. These were the communities that would benefit the most from a COVID vaccine because of the disproportionate impact of COVID on their communities, and they were showing the most resistance to getting vaccinated, or at least the least intention to get vaccinated. And I remember when those headlines started showing up, being like, well, wow, that is different, because that is something that's never been said about pediatric vaccines. Pediatric vaccines, it's been long assumed that your characteristic vaccine hesitator and refuser is a white affluent person, especially a mother. And there is actually a lot of research confirming that, research that I think is problematic and should be challenged. But because of this assumption that it's a sort of a white affluence problem, there's been very little investigation into how communities of color, who are many of whom are historically known to have less trust in healthcare due to poor experiences, both historic and contemporary. But it was somehow assumed that that this was this was part of the weirdness of vaccine hesitancy in the industrialized world, is the people that benefited the most from the system, so affluent people with lots of social capital, were the most resistant. And that is only part of the story. In fact, it misses a really big part of the story, which is people that don't benefit from the system are probably equally hesitant, if not more. We don't know for sure because the research really hasn't been done around pediatric vaccine hesitancy.
Okay, so, and I imagine, so in these two issues, financial conflicts of big pharma as well as experience of healthcare injustices, is there anything you can speak to those two specifically in relation to the development and the distribution of COVID-19 vaccines?
Certainly. The same concerns that people brought into flu vaccine and pediatric vaccines, people brought into their understanding of COVID. So unfortunately, we mainly have these survey research, and there are so many. I actually can't keep track of how many surveys have been done on COVID vaccine attitudes among Americans. Other countries kind of do big one. Yeah, I know maybe a few in Canada, but I know of maybe 20 surveys. Kaiser Foundation and Pew's Research. There's many polls of Americans. The same concerns that were prior seem to come in. I don't know for sure because there hasn't been much qualitative research. Unfortunately, these surveys just give us, numbers without the kind of qualification that we need. But at least initially, some of the numbers seem to fit. The same the same numbers of hesitancy that we saw around pediatric vaccines seem to match what we were seeing around COVID vaccines. And of course, there's been ups and downs that have been interesting to watch, like right around when Biden got elected, there was suddenly an up in vaccine acceptance, COVID vaccine acceptance, came back down again. But it definitely is, that should tell you that it is responsive to the political climate. Vaccine, and that's true of vaccines in general. Vaccine hesitancy is often a sign, or no, better to say a signal of what's going on in the social context. And that's what drives a lot of my thinking about vaccine hesitancy, is that it's an interesting phenomenon because a lot gets packed into our feelings and attitudes and behavior around vaccines, which makes vaccines themselves a really interesting technology to research from a science studies perspective.
Absolutely. Well, and just from a practical standpoint, it's really, I remember when, the discussion of vaccines happened about a year ago. And, I think, people well-intentioned, they come at it with this, we just need to educate people. We just need to tell them. And unfortunately, there's a little bit of arrogance. Like I follow a lot of public health experts, and they're just kind of like, actually, I should be more charitable. They don't typically, I think they're trying to come from a way of invitationally explaining the ideas, but there is this sort of like dismissal in some ways and we've even seen it today with like current events of just, dismissing or making fun of people's hesitancies. I think that there was like a recent skit on our sketch comedy show Saturday Night Live that kind of made fun of African Americans' hesitancy fund, but there was poking fun of it, but people found it particularly, not particularly sensitive, almost just dismissing as, they're not understanding the facts or whatnot. And this is just, I don't know, I think this is a much more nuanced and understanding view of how things are really, playing out and going forward. So I suppose, so in looking at this, so these are the major drivers. Okay, so I'm curious a couple things. One, knowing this in terms of understanding and how this vaccine hesitancy works, are you yourself, as a philosopher of science and a bioethicist, who are you engaging with in terms of maybe in practical efforts, either or to further understanding in this way or further practical efforts? So are you, do you talk with other philosophers, bioethicists, epidemiologists, psychologists, perhaps to understand what's going on in the minds of the world, the people that are hesitant? Who are the other actors and specialists who you're interacting with?
Great question. This project was very interdisciplinary. When I started the research into what is it that makes people hesitate about vaccines, there really wasn't philosophical work on that. There was ethics work on like whether it's okay to refuse vaccines, but the kind of epistemic work I wanted to do really hadn't been done. A little bit by the philosopher Mark Navin. So he's someone that I got to talk with, and that was helpful. But for the most part, there wasn't philosophy writing on this. So I had to look broadly, and luckily I've always done interdisciplinary type research because it just wasn't there in philosophy. So I started with science communications research. That's been a major source for me. A lot of the work was on climate change attitudes, the relevant work for me, climate change and sort of the divisiveness of climate change, especially in the U.S. context. So I read a lot about that, and there's some parallels to the kind of divisions there, but some differences too. So here's what I learned. I did that, and also reading a lot of social science research on vaccine hesitant parents. So I'll first say about the social science, the surveys and the interviews, and best of all, the qualitative research, the group discussions, the focus groups are the most valuable. First of all, there is a ton of social science research on vaccine hesitant parents. It is an area of interest to social scientists, and you can read many studies from many countries and really get nice little slices of what's going on in terms of vaccine hesitant parents, and even see patterns, which I'll speak to in a second. Why that hasn't translated into the kind of public-facing science communications that public health officers do is a mystery to me. It is all through my research years on this topic, it always struck me that the people that had the most public voices, they're usually physicians, infectious disease experts, public health, various people in public health, but usually with the more clinical end training like epidemiology. They just don't pay attention to that research, and they became wedded to this idea that people just don't understand the science. People are science denialists. Sometimes they get mad about it. I called it the war on science in the book, just to capture this sort of anger and frustration about those people and this enemy we need to vanquish, which is, apparently an illiterate or stupid public.
Yeah.
And it was very ignorant of the research there, because if you read the social science research, which I did, I read a lot of it, you are not seeing that. It is not the case that the parents don't understand the science. Well, there's two things going on. One is we actually know that levels of education and vaccine hesitancy are not correlated in that way. Some of the most vocal vaccine hesitators are highly educated, university degrees, postgraduate, you name it. People try to explain that away, so it's kind of known. That's remembered what I said about rich, affluent people being the most vaccine hesitant. So that should be a strike against the thesis that people don't understand science or are science illiterate, because these are university educated people. But instead, many of those people wedded to the war on science metaphor, they bring in auxiliary assumptions to try to explain that away. They say things like, "Oh, it must be Dunning-Kruger effect," or "a little knowledge is a dangerous thing," and they don't really get into what does it mean to say that. What qualifications do you have for saying that people overestimate their expertise? So I challenge that idea that this is an overestimation of expertise. I think there's other things going on there. So social science research, getting back to you said, where was I?
That's fine. So this is essentially it has been further written about, or like in some ideas related to, or at least demonstrating, look, it's not just, it can't be the communication, or like there's a lot of evidence supporting there's other things going on here. Yeah.
Yeah. And here I got to bring in my philosophy training, because we needed a different explanation. So I think people just stick to this narrative about war on science. And these might be the scientists that just don't have alternative frameworks to really think about it. While we, luckily, as philosophers, we come up with new frameworks and theories all the time. And I said, I think this is an epistemic trust problem. That seems more likely to me. And, I was already very familiar with the wonderful research out there in science studies on epistemic dependence and epistemic trust, and how relations, informational relationships with other people largely shape what we know. And I said, that's what I see going on here, because thinking back to these vaccine hesitant parents that I'm reading and their blogs and books, I did a lot of reading to hear what they say. They understand the scientific consensus perfectly. They know what their doctors are going to tell them or have told them to do. So it's not, and that's really all the understanding you need to make this healthcare decision. I vaccinated my kids. I didn't have to understand everything about vaccine science. I understood what the consensus was, and I made an informed decision that that's what I was going to follow. Similarly, they understand the consensus too, but they don't trust it. There's something that keeps them from following through on that. So that's where the question should be. What makes me take that, they call it a leap of faith in some of the sociological literature, what allows me to bracket all the uncertainties that I don't know and leap in favor of vaccines, and as someone who's situated differently than me can probably have the same understanding of the consensus and not. So that's where you need to be asking the question, not looking at which one of us are more scientifically literate. Anecdotally, I'd say that vaccine hesitators and refusers do more research than vaccine acceptors. I read 0 papers on pediatric vaccines. No, I know where I stand, and I know where my community stands. It's got a lot to do. I realize that it's got to do a lot with my social relationships to other people. That's where I actually brought in social psychology. You wanted to know who I've been consulting. There's excellent work on cultural cognition that I draw from heavily in my book. So cultural cognition is this explanation of why we tend to cluster in terms of views about science and things like that. For example, vaccine refusers tend to live in sort of clustered communities. Similarly, there are communities which have high degrees of vaccine acceptors, and it's not about one community being educated and the other one not being educated. It's got more to do with our ties to other people. So, like it or not, I do what my friends do, unless I have very compelling reasons not to. So my unwillingness to fully investigate pediatric vaccines actually says a lot about my social situation and less about my level of expertise on vaccines.
Great. So I'm fascinated by this concept of epistemic trust, and as someone who's also studied psychology, my questions are sort of like, well, what is it about an individual, or perhaps in their context, that would lead them? Why do you trust, but this person over there doesn't? And so, that's not exactly a philosophical question. It's more, or it could, I suppose, depending on the kind of question, but because I was just reading through, I have a couple friends who are hesitant, and they've provided basically to a T what you described. One is essentially just completely mistrust, usually in whether the government's transparency, the changing of or the side effects, the success rates, So, what is it about? I don't know. What is it about people's tendency for this mistrust? And I'm trying to come at it as in a way, not as again, you don't know the facts, but what do you think?
Oh, there's a lot to say on that. It does. The questions about epistemic trust should lead you to be asking, who are the people we trust for information? That's where a major difference is. So I spend a lot of time in the book getting into philosophy of expertise and sociology of expertise. Philosophy of expertise is still sort of a newer thing. Sociology of expertise, however, is humongous. I had to do a lot of catch up to work efficiently on expertise. And this is where the epistemic trust comes in. So we look around. Most of us cannot know things for ourselves. Knowledge is social that way. We instead look to other people to help make sense of things. One is because we just don't have the time, energy, and sometimes the skill to study all things independently. So because of that, we we look to other people for cues or heuristics about, any new piece of information. So you and I can read the same news report on a new study, but we often will need a little bit of help in terms of knowing how to prioritize that information. Let's say it's a piece of information that is completely contrast to everything we knew and believed about, let's say, vaccines or something like that. So what do I do with this information? Do I ignore it? Do I just park it and think about it later? Do I radically alter all my views? We usually need a little bit of help with that, because just reading one news report or one study is not going to is never enough, and nor should it be enough. As we know, as philosophers of science, any one study is only giving us a little piece of information, and we don't know how it fits with other things. So sociologists of expertise will sometimes detail how it is that we need to look to experts to help us, give us that context of how to prioritize it. And the question is who the experts are. We've got many theorists have put together these hierarchies of expertise where, so I'm thinking of Collins has done this, and Salinger and a few others have these hierarchy, Elizabeth Anderson too, the philosopher. They've created these, they map out these hierarchies of expertise where it's usually the person with the most epistemic credentials. So let's say a PhD as opposed to a BS, you call it a BS, we call it BSc, would be more trusted. And the closer your area of expertise is to the question will be relevant too. So, your PhD in physics doesn't make you a great expert on vaccines, but your PhD in immunology will make you much closer to the core expert group, the people I should be listening to on questions about expertise. Right. So that's sort of the traditional hierarchy. Yet now we've got this phenomena with which some people inappropriately think is the death of expertise. I don't think it's that at all. We've got this phenomena where people actually trust the conventional experts less because they're in that core group. So that core group,
they're in on it. They're in on it.
Yeah, Collins calls it the core set. Are seen as troubled somehow, that they've been paid off by big pharma. They've got other interests in place. So instead of trusting the immunologist at the CDC the most, there's this turning towards unconventional experts, all kinds of unconventional experts, but notably a lot of those conventionally trained experts that stand outside of the system. So Wakefield has become quite the maverick and is very highly admired by people who are resistant to vaccines. And it's not the death of expertise. They admire him and sorry, I lost this.
Oh, okay.
Okay, what was I saying?
Death of expert. It's not the death of expertise.
It's not the death of expertise. They admire and trust Wakefield largely because he has the conventional credentials. He's got the PhD, the MD. He was once very highly regarded in his field as a researcher. But they also trust him because he's willing to use their thinking, willing to speak truth to power. He's willing to actually challenge the orthodoxy. So what they're drawing on there is they've got the epistemic credentials, but he's also got what they see as outstanding moral character, because he's not afraid to speak out, and he of course he's going to get dragged through the mud, and of course he's going to lose his license, and now he's this martyr figure, and he's regarded as much more trustworthy. So that says something about how we identify experts and put our trust in them, as being being epistemically dependent as we are, as we look for the right kind of knowledge base, but we also look for the right moral character. We want to make sure that the expert is speaking with our interests at heart. Because if you've got all the credentials, but you've been bought out by big pharma, you might lie to me. And trusting is a difficult thing. We are all vulnerable to being misled. So we're looking for these kind of characters. Second order assessment is what Elizabeth Anderson called it, that we don't always know if you're telling me the right thing, because I'm not an expert, I wouldn't know, but I can do some kind of assessment of you and what I think of your character, whether I think you're trustworthy.
Yeah. So I appreciate it. It's happy to hear. I'm happy to hear your optimism in the face of this. And so others have years describing that others call it the death of expertise. You would call it, I guess, I don't know, the emergence of
reconfiguring.
Reconfiguring. Could you explain
how about a proliferation of expertise?
Yeah. So could you maybe? And I know we're coming close on time here, but maybe one more question. Just explain a little bit about what leads you to think of, in terms of this reconfiguration. What how do you see what do you see that playing out, and perhaps from your from your knowledge base and your skill set of understanding, what that looks like and why that's not necessarily such a bad thing.
I think the account that I'm giving is actually more enabling for experts. So I'm thinking of those frustrated doctors who can't believe their patients argue with them about things they read on the internet. They say, all is not lost. This is actually an opportunity for the experts to listen to the points of mistrust and recenter expertise and reinvigorate expertise by attending to those sources of mistrust. So instead of telling people why they're wrong, listen to what the concerns are, because some of those concerns are directly relevant to the way that experts do their work. So things like financial conflicts of interest in medicine, even if you think that all the statements about big pharma and big pharma corrupting science are overblown, and there are people that say that. I think they're wrong to say that, but there are people that say that. That's not important. We don't need to argue about how good or how bad big pharma is. What we have to agree on is that they've got a credibility problem. We've got tons of empirical evidence showing that the public is not happy with current arrangements between industry and health research and health practice. And if you want to get your public stakeholders on board with things like a mass vaccination campaign, you need to attend to this. So this is a great reason to create more distance between industry influence and health research. There's been many proposals for how we could do this. None of them get a lot of uptake because the people in power that actually have the power to change these arrangements benefit so much from it that they don't want to do it. So I'm kind of hopeful that maybe this would be a good moment with a global pandemic to say, you know what, our system is not working, because short of mandating vaccines for everyone in the world, which we will never do, you need a lot of public trust in order to do public health. And I feel for those physicians. I feel frustrated by these, but they are working within a system. They might be the greatest physicians ever, and people do generally trust their physicians. But if they don't trust the system, that work that healthcare providers are doing is always going to be pushing up against a system that's not trusted. So I think even experts should be getting behind the effort to create more separation between industry influence and health practice. I think it's actually better for patient care, but if anything, it'll get the kind of trust building that we need in order to handle public health crises. So this is a chance for the experts to stand up, not to sit back and say, well, I guess we can't do anything about it. This is much more enabling.
Fantastic. And so, I can imagine next steps are trust building. One last question. I was kind of curious in terms of, these notions of epistemic trust. You had mentioned kind of briefly that perhaps trust in climate science. You had done some research, or at least a review of some of the literature in there. I'm curious how applicable, what other potential applications you've perhaps thought about or thought about applying this kind of analysis toward in other sort of related areas. So obviously what comes to mind is like climate denialism. There's a vast amount of research on that. I imagine there's going to be other things that people don't trust, whether it's, and so I'm curious, I guess part of me is sort of interested in, is there something particularly unique about vaccines or just personal health care in general that is perhaps could be separated or distinct from something like climate science or some other application here? Is there something unique to be said about it, or is it pretty much the general problem in terms of? mistrust of experts or this epistemic trust?
I think the issues of epistemic trust are very similar. And there's also many of the players that go in, like, industry-funded disinformation campaigns are playing in both. When I first started on vaccines, it wasn't as politicized as climate. Remember, at the time when I started, climate research was huge. Was politicized such that there was this even divide between Republicans and a very clear divide, I should say, between Republicans and Democrats, for example, about whether they think climate change is real. And I remember some of the commentators, I think a political scientist wrote an op-ed in the New York Times saying, whatever you do with vaccines, don't let it get politicized like climate science. Because at the time we kind of had vaccine hesitancy and vaccine acceptance on both the left and the right, because there were ideological reasons to hold either view. And of course, that has not happened. It's gotten more politicized in that time. In the years since I started doing research, and sort of vaccine refusal got tied up with all kinds of sort of right-leaning populist campaigns, and then there was a vaccine refuser in the White House for a few years. So it has created that, and we're seeing this now about who's most resistant to COVID vaccines, and it's all the people who think Trump unfairly was removed from office. So we're seeing that kind of, the politics, unfortunately, are going in that bad direction that climate change did. Look, there are lots
very
of nuances and lots of differences, but the similarities are there. Yeah. And so I'm kind of hoping, I'd like to see more research. So the research that I kind of end the book saying, I give some kind of guidelines for things we can do to build trust.
Sure,
and I say, and the general idea is that you put, instead of starting with this idea of misunderstanding and a war on science, put trust at the center and build your interventions, public health interventions from there, where you're trying to build and maintain trust as a priority. And that does involve giving people accurate information and dealing with disinformation, but it's with an eye towards building trust, because it's those trust relationships that allow public health to work well. And I'd like to see a sort of trust-centered research happening in other areas, around, let's say, genetically modified foods, climate change. It would be interesting to see that. And I'm not convinced that all is lost and that we can't sort of rebuild our relationships to each other and our relationships to institutions. But part of the onus is on these institutions to render themselves credible. So to make the public see themselves as trustworthy, and don't do things like ignore the cries of the public for distance from corporate influence, or from, appalling medical racism and health injustice, and pretend that that's somehow secondary to our current concerns about vaccine hesitancy. It is central to it.
No, thank you. And my hope is, I'm starting to see, the way, at least in the United States, there's some movements toward at least getting those folks who people do trust to accept, to come out and speak positively. And also, just from a personal experience, it's been actually very encouraging to see the rollout of vaccines here. But what's the downside is that's just not everywhere in the world. It's usually the United States is not that great with healthcare, and it's been interesting to see just sort of an expedient rollout relative to other things. It's been. I'm curious to see how that might influence trust, insofar as some sort of big part of the Western world, especially in the United States, tends to have probably. I'm not sure of the rates of, like, if we were to rate the highest levels of mistrust, is it even across countries, or is there are there certain countries where, like, mistrust is just way higher than others?
Yes, they do a lot of global tracking of public attitudes towards, let's say, government and business and healthcare among others. And yes, there is variety. And I know the U.S. got some attention for very, very low numbers, let's say in the past 10 years. So it would be interesting to see what happens from it. I mean, and I also understand that in the United States that these vaccines are being offered for free. So now you guys get a taste of.
Yeah,
is that true?
Yes. Yeah, it's a.
Now you're getting a taste of universal healthcare.
What it's like to live in Canada. This is amazing. This is like, oh my god. Yeah.
Maybe you'll start a movement because it's pretty great, isn't it?
Oh, it's phenomenal, and it's just yeah. So it's I'm hoping sort of like actions speak louder than words in terms of potentially building trust. So hopefully we continue to move, more toward a, trust building as opposed to just simply transactional healthcare exchanges that, things will be well. So, Maya, Dr. Goldenberg, thank you so much for taking the time. Let me ask our final question, and then we'll wrap up very quickly is, in terms of, philosophy of science, philosophy of medicine, what do you see as some of the greatest challenges facing philosophy of science today? And perhaps if you want to suss that in the context of, your research of studying vaccine hesitancy or studying, evidence-based medicine, what are some of the greatest challenges for you as a philosopher of sciences and as a bioethicist in, approaching these problems?
I'll say that it's something that I'm very interested in is getting philosophers of science more engaged with scientific communities. So I'm applauding. There's been movement towards that. We've now got several centers for philosophers of science engaging with scientists and engaging with the public. So I was just at the University of Cincinnati recently, where they've got a center dedicated to this. There's another one at Michigan State, another one at Adelaide, and I think we need more of that. The humanities tend to get sidelined, and there's nothing like a pandemic to remind us that these issues, that these huge global complex issues are not going to be solved by science alone. So I want to promote interdisciplinary work all the way through and recognize that it's hard to do that as arts programs and humanities programs lose funding, get closed, grant money is hard to come by. All the while the money always gets thrown towards STEM and
right.
So you only need something like AI research to realize that, you lose your bearing if you don't have at least some humanities and ethics involvement as technology just rides ahead. So this is a plea for more publicly engaged philosophy of science and more opportunities for that.
Fantastic. Well, again, Dr. Goldenberg, thank you so much for taking the time this morning. And it was a great pleasure speaking with you. I'm very excited to read the book. Again, the book, Vaccine Hesitancy, Public Trust, Expertise, and the War on Science. Have a wonderful rest of your Thursday, and hope to see you at the next conference eventually once we're all meeting again.
Thanks so much.
All right, thank you. Have a wonderful day.